June 22nd, 1940. In a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, the same carriage where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918, French officials sign an armistice with Nazi Germany. 6 weeks of fighting have killed 90,000 French soldiers and 60,000 French civilians. 10 million people have fled south in the largest mass exodus in European history. Now it's over. France has surrendered. But across the English Channel, Winston Churchill announces Britain will fight on alone. In the streets of Paris, now occupied by German troops, in the villages of Normandy still smouldering from bombardment, French civilians hear this news and react in ways that reveal something profound about defeat, hope, and what it means to watch your ally stand firm while your own country falls. June 18th, 1940, 4 days before the armistice signing. Marie Dubois stood in her bakery in the 15th arrondissement of Paris, listening to a radio she'd hidden beneath the counter. The voice was unfamiliar. A French general she'd never heard of, broadcasting from London. "France has lost a battle," the voice said, "but France has not lost the war." General Charles de Gaulle. The name meant nothing to most French citizens. A junior officer, barely known, calling for continued resistance from the safety of England, while German boots already echoed on Parisian cobblestones. Marie switched off the radio. Through her shop window, she could see them. Wehrmacht soldiers, neat grey uniforms, cameras around their necks, posing for photographs in front of the Eiffel Tower like tourists. 4 days earlier, they'd entered a city the French government had declared open to avoid destruction. Now they owned it. The surrender hadn't felt like a decision. It had felt like physics, like gravity. 150 miles to the north, in the village of Étaples, near the coast, Jean-Paul Moreau sat in his fishing boat, which hadn't left harbour in 3 weeks. British and French troops had evacuated from Dunkirk in early June, leaving behind equipment, vehicles, hope. The beaches still bore the scars. Burned-out trucks, half submerged in sand, personal belongings scattered like debris after a storm. German sentries now patrolled those same beaches. They'd requisitioned boats, including Jean-Paul's. Not destroyed them. Requisitioned. Correct paperwork, polite requests in broken French, promises of compensation that everyone knew would never come. Jean-Paul had watched the British leave, thousands of them, crammed onto every vessel that could float, abandoning France to its fate. Or so it seemed. But now, the wireless brought different news. Prime Minister Churchill, speaking to Parliament, declaring Britain would never surrender, would fight on the beaches, in the streets, in the hills, would never give in. Jean-Paul's neighbour, Etienne, spat into the harbour water when he heard it. Easy for him to say, he has an island, we have German tanks in our streets. But Jean-Paul said nothing. Because he'd seen something Etienne hadn't. During the evacuation, he'd helped ferry British soldiers from the beach to larger ships offshore. Young men, terrified, exhausted, beaten. One of them, a private, maybe 19 years old, had looked back at the French coastline as the boat pulled away. "I'm sorry," the British boy had said. In French, badly pronounced but sincere, "Je suis désolé." Sorry for leaving. Sorry for surviving. Sorry for what came next. Now Churchill said they'd fight on. And Jean-Paul wondered, was it defiance or delusion? In Bordeaux, where the French government had fled before the armistice, Simone Laurent stood in the crowd outside the prefecture, waiting for news. She'd walked 15 miles that day after her car ran out of petrol that no station had to sell. Her husband was somewhere in the remains of the French army, alive, she hoped, but she hadn't heard from him in 3 weeks. The news came via loudspeaker. Marshal Pétain, the hero of Verdun, the 84-year-old savior chosen to lead France in its darkest hour, announcing the armistice. His voice crackling but firm. "I give to France the gift of my person. It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today that we must cease the fighting." Around Simone, the reaction split like a fracture line through stone. Some wept with relief. The killing would stop. Their sons, husbands, brothers might come home. Others stood silent, faces rigid with something between shame and rage. An elderly man near Simone removed his military medals, First World War decorations, and held them in his palm, staring at them as if they'd become hieroglyphics in an extinct language. "We held them at Verdun," he said to no one in particular. "For months we held them, and now—" He didn't finish. There was nothing to say. But the armistice brought conditions no one had fully understood until the terms emerged. France would be divided, the North and West, including Paris, under direct German occupation. The South, a so-called free zone under Pétain's government in Vichy, free in name only, a puppet state dancing to German music. And the ultimate humiliation, France would pay the costs of its own occupation. 400 million francs per day, the conqueror would send the conquered the bill. Then came Churchill's speech. Britain would fight on. The Royal Navy would not surrender. The RAF would continue. The British Empire would resist. In Paris, Marie heard it on her hidden radio and felt something she couldn't name. In a tap, Jean-Paul heard it and thought of the British boy who'd apologized. In Bordeaux, Simone heard it and wondered if her husband would consider it hope or betrayal. None of them knew it yet, but this divergence, France accepting defeat, Britain refusing it, would define not just the war, but their understanding of what defeat meant, what resistance meant, what it cost to keep fighting, and what it cost to stop. The question wasn't whether Britain could win. The question was whether Britain's refusal to accept reality was courage or madness. And French civilians living under German occupation would find themselves forced to answer. June 23, 1940. The day after the armistice. In Paris, the German occupation settled into a routine that felt surreal in its orderliness. Wehrmacht soldiers bought postcards, visited the Louvre, drank coffee at sidewalk cafes. They paid for everything. Occupation marks, the new currency, worthless paper backed by nothing but tanks. Marie kept her bakery open because the alternative was starvation. German soldiers came in the morning, polite, requesting bread in halting French. She served them in silence. What else could she do? But in the back room, she kept the radio hidden. And each evening after the Germans left, she tuned to the BBC. The broadcasts from London came through waves of static, signal strength varying with weather and German jamming efforts. But the message was consistent. Britain would not surrender. British aircraft were striking back at German positions. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. To Marie, listening in occupied Paris, these words felt like messages from another planet. Britain could fight because Britain hadn't fallen. Britain could be defiant because British children weren't walking past Wehrmacht checkpoints on their way to school. But something else came through those broadcasts. Something that made her hand still over the radio dial. The BBC began broadcasting messages to France. Not military orders, there was no French military left to order. Messages to civilians, reminders that France's surrender was the government's decision, not the people's. Suggestions that resistance, even small resistance, still mattered. And then came de Gaulle's follow-up broadcast, July 1st. His voice stronger now, more confident. Whatever happens, the flame of French resistance must not and will not go out. Marie switched off the radio and sat in the darkness of her back room. The flame of resistance. What did that even mean when German sentries stood on every corner? 150 miles north, Jean-Paul faced a different calculation. The occupation in coastal areas was harsher. The Germans were building something. Concrete fortifications, gun emplacements, obstacles on the beaches. They needed workers. They needed boats. Collaborate or starve. Those were the options, though no one used the word collaborate yet. That would come later. For now, it was simply survival. But the British were across the channel, 25 miles of water. On clear days, you could almost see the English coast from Étampes. And at night, Jean-Paul could sometimes hear distant sounds, engines, maybe explosions, maybe thunder. The war continuing just beyond the horizon. Etienne, his neighbor, had made his choice. He'd registered his boat for German use, accepted their requisition payments, began making runs, transporting supplies along the coast under Wehrmacht supervision. "The war is over," Etienne said. "Churchill's just too stubborn to admit it." But Jean-Paul had heard something else through the fishing community's network. British coastal raiders, small craft, striking at night, hitting German positions along the French coast, disappearing before reinforcements arrived. Not often, not effectively, but happening. Britain hadn't given up. Britain was striking back, and every German fortification built on French beaches was preparation for something. The Germans didn't build defenses against enemies who'd surrendered. They built them against enemies who might return. In Bordeaux, Simone finally received word about her husband. He was alive. He was a prisoner. He was being held in a camp in Germany, along with 1.8 million other French soldiers the armistice hadn't freed. The news came through official channels, Red Cross notifications, processed with German efficiency. "Your husband is alive. You may send 1 letter per month. Packages are permitted under these restrictions." Simone held the notification in her kitchen, reading it 5 times, 6 times. Relief and rage mixing until she couldn't separate them. He'd fought, he'd been captured, and now he'd spend the war in a German prison camp while Petain's government told France to accept defeat with dignity. But Britain hadn't accepted defeat. And something about that fact, stubborn, perhaps stupid, definitely desperate, made Simone's grief feel different. Less like the end of something and more like a pause. She began listening to the BBC, secretly, like Marie in Paris. Like thousands, perhaps millions, of French civilians discovering that a hidden radio could make occupied France feel less like a prison and more like territory temporarily lost. The broadcasts were careful. They didn't tell French civilians to rebel. They didn't order sabotage or resistance. That would come later. For now, they simply reminded France that the war continued, that Britain fought on, that defeat wasn't permanent unless you accepted it as permanent. In Vichy, the new French government worked frantically to define what France's relationship with Germany would be. Not collaboration. That word wasn't used officially. Cooperation. France maintaining sovereignty by choosing cooperation over destruction. Pétain addressed the nation regularly. Grandfather figure, steady voice, reminding France that he'd saved them at Verdun and would save them now. The cost of continued resistance would be annihilation. The wisdom of accepting reality would be survival. And many French civilians believed him. Not because they loved Germany. Hatred for the occupier was nearly universal. But because the alternative seemed suicidal. Britain's defiance looked noble from London. From Paris, from Lyon, from Marseille, it looked like a death wish France had already paid in blood. But a minority, small at first, growing slowly, began to question the math. If Britain could fight, if Britain had the Royal Navy and the RAF and the Empire's resources, then maybe Germany wasn't invincible. Maybe the war wasn't over. Maybe France's surrender wasn't the end. Maybe it was an intermission. This divide, those who accepted defeat and those who couldn't, ran through families, friendships, entire communities. Etienne called Jean-Paul a fool for refusing German payment. Simone's sister told her to stop listening to BBC lies and accept that France needed peace. In Paris, Marie's neighbor informed her that keeping the bakery open for Germans was unpatriotic, while her other neighbor said refusing would mean someone else would just take her business. There was no clear moral line. Survival required compromise. Dignity required resistance. and the two seemed impossible to reconcile. Then, on July 3, 1940, just 11 days after France's surrender, everything changed. The news came through German-controlled radio first, delivered with barely suppressed satisfaction. The British Royal Navy had attacked the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in Algeria. Not attacked Germans, attacked French ships that, under the armistice, had been ordered to disarm and remain in French ports. Ships that Britain feared would fall into German hands. Ships that Britain had given an ultimatum: join us, sail to British ports, or be destroyed. The French admiral refused. The British opened fire. 297 French sailors died, killed by their former ally. In Paris, Marie heard the news and felt something crack inside her chest. In Etaples, Jean-Paul stood on the dock, staring across the channel toward England, and felt rage replacing whatever sympathy had lingered. In Bordeaux, Simone threw her hidden radio against the wall, where it shattered into pieces. The German propaganda machine didn't need to work hard. The facts spoke for themselves. Britain, claiming to be France's loyal ally, had killed French sailors rather than risk their ships falling into German hands. Pétain addressed the nation again, his voice older now, tired. France has been betrayed by her former ally. Britain has shown her true nature. And for a moment, a week, perhaps two, the question of whether Britain's defiance was courage or madness seemed answered. It was cruelty, it was betrayal, it was proof that France had been right to surrender and Britain was wrong to continue. But then the counter-arguments began. Quiet at first, whispered in markets, discussed in shuttered cafes after curfew. The British had given the French fleet options. The admiral had refused, and if those ships had fallen into German hands, if Germany had added France's navy to its own, how many more would have died? The arguments weren't about forgiveness. Forgiveness was impossible. They were about calculation, about what Mers el-Kebir proved. Britain was genuinely willing to fight Germany, willing to pay any price, make any sacrifice, accept any cost, even killing 1,197 French sailors. It was monstrous. It was also proof that Churchill meant what he said. Britain would never surrender. Summer turned to fall. German occupation of northern France settled into routine. The initial shock, enemy soldiers in French streets, faded into grim normalcy. People adapted because humans always adapt. They learned which Wehrmacht officers were dangerous and which ones just wanted to go home. They learned when curfew was enforced and when it could be bent. They learned how to get food, how to stay warm, how to survive. But the question of Britain lingered like smoke. In September, the Luftwaffe began the Battle of Britain. German bombers filled the skies over London, attempting to force British surrender through terror. The BBC broadcasts Marie listened to in Paris carried the sounds of air raid sirens, explosions, anti-aircraft fire. Britain was burning. Surely now, she thought, Churchill would see reason. Surely now, Britain would accept that Germany had won. But the broadcasts continued. Day after day, night after night, British pilots shot down German bombers. British civilians slept in underground stations. British resolve somehow held, and Marie found herself doing something she couldn't quite explain. Each morning when German soldiers came to buy bread, she looked at their faces. Young men, mostly. Tired. Some of them had been pulled from France to participate in the Britain campaign, then sent back when Britain didn't fall as quickly as expected. One German corporal, maybe 22 years old, from Bavaria, always polite, came in one morning with a bandage on his hand. "Training accident," he said in broken French, embarrassed. "Clumsy." But Marie had heard the explosions 2 nights before. Not training. RAF bombers, striking German installations in occupied France. The British weren't just defending their island. They were hitting back. The corporal bought his bread and left. And Marie thought, Britain is killing French sailors and German soldiers and losing its own cities to bombing, and still they won't stop. It should have felt like madness. Instead, it felt like something she'd almost forgotten. Defiance. In Etaples, Jean-Paul made a decision that would risk everything. He began passing information to the resistance. The word resistance was still new, still undefined. There was no organization yet, no formal structure. Just individuals who couldn't accept occupation, who'd begun finding each other through whispered conversations and careful trust. Jean-Paul reported German ship movements. Supplies being moved along the coast, fortification construction, information that, if it reached London, might help British bombers know where to strike. He didn't do it because he'd forgiven Britain for Mers el-Kebir. He hadn't. He did it because the alternative, accepting occupation forever, felt like dying by degrees. Etienne discovered what Jean-Paul was doing. They'd been friends for 30 years. Now they stood on the dock, 10 feet apart, with a friendship dying in the space between them. "They'll shoot you," Etienne said. "The Germans don't play games with spies." "The war isn't over," Jean-Paul replied. "Yes, it is. France surrendered. Churchill's just too proud to admit Britain's next. Maybe. Or maybe Germany bit off more than it can chew." Etienne shook his head. "You're throwing your life away for England. England, Jean-Paul, the country that killed our sailors." "I'm not doing it for England. I'm doing it because I can't do nothing." They never spoke again. Etienne reported to German authorities regularly, not about Jean-Paul, but about his own work, his boat, his compliance. Jean-Paul slipped information to resistance contacts who passed it to networks that somehow reached London. Two men who'd fished the same waters their entire lives, now divided by a question of whether surrender was wisdom or surrender was surrender. In Bordeaux, Simone received a second letter from her husband. Brief, censored, written in handwriting she barely recognized because he was trying to get messages past German censors. "I think of you always," the letter said. "I dream of home. I hope the garden is growing well." They didn't have a garden. They'd lived in an apartment, but Simone understood. He was telling her something was growing, something the Germans couldn't see but he believed existed. Hope, maybe, or resistance. Or simply the refusal to accept that this was permanent. She'd gotten a new radio. A neighbor had one, hidden, illegal, dangerous. Simone listened to the BBC again, and this time the broadcasts included something new. Messages, personnels, strange phrases that meant nothing to most listeners. "The giraffe has a long neck." "The moon is full in September." "Jean has 3 brothers." Code. Messages to resistance networks inside France. Proof that something was organizing, something was growing, something was fighting back. Britain was no longer alone either. Its empire was mobilizing. Canada, Australia, India sending troops, and rumors, persistent, impossible to confirm, suggested America might join eventually. Simone looked at her husband's letter again. The garden is growing well. Maybe he'd heard rumors in the prison camp. Maybe he was guessing, or maybe he just needed to believe it. By December 1940, the initial question, whether Britain's defiance was courage or madness, had evolved. Britain hadn't fallen. German bombers had failed to break British will. The war continued, and French civilians, living under occupation, faced a new calculation. If Britain could hold, if the war wasn't over, then every compromise with the Germans, every piece of collaboration, every moment of cooperation, might matter later. Not everyone reached the same conclusion. Many French civilians continued to believe Pétain had made the right choice. Germany controlled Europe from the Atlantic to Moscow's doorstep. Britain was an island holding out through stubbornness and geography, but eventually reality would force surrender. But others, a minority growing slowly into something larger, began to see Britain's continued resistance as proof of possibility. The war wasn't over. Defeat wasn't final. and perhaps France's surrender had been a tactical loss, not a permanent end. The division between these perspectives would define the next 4 years. Collaboration versus resistance, survival versus dignity, acceptance versus defiance, and much of it traced back to that first shock. France surrendered, but Britain fought on, and French civilians had to decide what that meant. The war would last another 4.5 years after France fell. British and American forces would land in Normandy in June 1944, liberating France through grinding, costly combat. Over 200,000 French civilians would die during the occupation. Over 300,000 French resistance members would be arrested, with 90,000 killed. The questions French civilians asked in June 1940, whether Britain's defiance was courage or madness, whether accepting occupation was wisdom or surrender, would be answered in blood and time. Marie Dubois kept her bakery open throughout the occupation. She also kept her radio hidden. By 1942, she joined a resistance network, passing information through bread deliveries to safe houses across Paris. In August 1944, during the Paris uprising, German soldiers shot her outside her own shop. She survived, barely, and lived to see Paris liberated 3 days later. Asked in 1968 about Britain's decision to fight on after France fell, Marie took a long time to answer. "At first I thought Churchill was insane," she said. "France had 110 divisions and fell in 6 weeks. Britain had 30 divisions and an island. How could they possibly think they'd win?" She paused, looking out her window at a rebuilt Paris where German signs and checkpoints existed only in memory. But then I realized something. Surrender made sense militarily. We'd lost, Germany had won. Accepting that was rational, but Churchill refused to accept it, and his refusal, that stubborn, impossible refusal, changed the equation. As long as Britain fought, the war wasn't over, and as long as the war wasn't over, we hadn't truly lost. We'd just lost the first round. Jean-Paul Moreau was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943. They never proved his resistance work. Not definitively, but suspicion was enough. He spent 2 years in Buchenwald concentration camp. He weighed 85 pounds when American forces liberated the camp in April 1945. He returned to Etaples and rebuilt his fishing business. Etienne, his former friend, had been shot in 1944, not by Germans, but by French resistance members who considered him a collaborator. The truth was more complicated. Etienne had hidden Jewish children in his basement while officially cooperating with German authorities. He'd saved 11 lives while appearing to collaborate. No one knew until after his death. "We judged each other so harshly," Jean-Paul said in 1979, standing on the same dock, where he and Etienne had argued 4 decades earlier. "He thought I was throwing my life away. I thought he was a coward. We were both wrong and both right." He looked across the channel toward England, still visible on clear days. Britain standing firm didn't save France. We had to save ourselves. But it gave us something to stand firm toward. It proved the war wasn't over. That mattered more than we understood at the time. Simone Laurent's husband survived his prison camp. He returned in 1945, 30 pounds lighter, 20 years older. They had 4 children. They never discussed the war years, too painful, too complicated, too many compromises neither wanted to examine too closely. But in 1984, Simone attended a commemoration of the 40th anniversary of D-Day. British, American, Canadian veterans, many now in their 60s, walking the beaches where they'd landed to liberate France. A British veteran, maybe 70 years old, approached her. He'd seen her French resistance medal. "Thank you for what you did," he said in careful French. Simone shook her head. "We did very little. You liberated us." "No," the veteran said. "You held on. You kept France alive inside while we were on the outside. If you'd truly accepted defeat, all of you, there would have been no France to liberate. Just German territory." They stood together on the beach, looking at the ocean that had separated their countries during the darkest years. "Churchill was right to keep fighting," Simone said. "But he was only right because you all made it true. Britain promised not to surrender, then kept that promise even when keeping it was nearly impossible. That's what mattered. Not the promise, but the keeping." The German occupation of France lasted 1,143 days. British resistance lasted every single one of them, and somewhere in that mathematics of endurance, French civilians found their own answers to impossible questions. Not all the same answers, not simple answers, but answers they could live with, or die for, or carry for the rest of their lives.